thank you very much. Thanks for that generous introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here at the University of Washington, and especially to enjoy your wonderful weather. I have a lot of good colleagues and friends here, so I just really want to thank all the wonderful people that I've got to spend time with over the past 2 days, but especially a shout out to Jody Bourgeois, who's responsible for my being here today and did most of the legwork to get me here. So what I wanted to talk about today, what actually you asked me to talk about, was this question of the dynamics of disbelief. As many of us know, scientists struggle with the fact that even though we may do very detailed work, very outstanding work that we think is persuasive and correct, it doesn't mean that the public at large or the population at large necessarily accepts the results of our work. And in the case of climate change, what we see is that, well, what I'm going to talk about today is that there's a whole dynamic of disbelief. And so what Eric, Conway, and I attempted to do in our book, Merchants of Doubt, and also in the film that we've helped to make from it, of which I'll show a few clips tonight, is to really understand the dynamics of disbelief, to try to understand who are the people who tell us that climate change is a hoax, or that the science isn't settled, or that there isn't a consensus, and why do they say these really quite extraordinary things. So I always like to start my talks with good news and end with good news, and then the whole middle part is kind of depressing. So the good news is that actually the vast majority of the American people do accept that climate change is happening. As Bloomberg News puts it, even Republicans. So actually there's a very interesting poll that Bloomberg News published just a few months ago looking at the dynamics of belief or acceptance of climate science among Democrats and Republicans. And as most of us know, views on this issue are very polarized. The vast majority of Democrats and independents in this country accept the scientific evidence. That is to say, they have views that are consistent with what the scientific community says. Climate change is real, it's happening, it's mostly caused by greenhouse gases. About 85 to 90% of Democrats are in line in their views with what scientists would say is correct. But that's not true for Republicans. In fact, as I was saying earlier, one of the sort of depressing things is that actually among Republicans, the more educated they are, the less their views line up with what scientists would say is correct. So this is a little bit of a depressing result for those of us who believe in education. But nevertheless, we have a little bit of good news. As you can see here, do I have a pointer? It looks like I do. Yeah, as you can see here, Republican acceptance of scientific evidence on climate change has been hovering around 50% for a while, going back to 2012. But just sort of this last year, there was a big uptick up towards 60%. And that's a pretty big change in a poll. I mean, most issues, things don't change very much very quickly. So there is some good news here. The majority of American people are in line with the science, and that's really important to remember. We shouldn't get too depressed. It's not the case that the vast majority of people have extraordinarily weird views. Actually, most of us are kind of in the right ballpark. Okay, now it goes downhill from there. So the problem is that we've actually slipped from where we were in the past. More Americans actually accepted the scientific evidence in the past. So just to give you one example, in 2007 there was a poll done by the Gallup polling organization that showed that 72% of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, were completely or mostly convinced that global warming was happening. So we've had this situation where public opinion has been very fickle, very unsteady, going up and down, and we've actually lost ground since the year 2007, and actually lost ground even since 1988 when people first started doing polling. So how is it that so many Americans have been persuaded for so long that man-made climate change wasn't happening when scientists were telling us that it was? So I want to start with just a little film clip from Merchants of Doubt, because now I'm in the enviable position that I actually have a movie of my book, and I can show you film clips, which is a whole lot more fun than just talking. So this is a clip from the film. And this man is Bill O'Keefe. He was the director for many years of the George C. Marshall Institute, a think tank that was kind of the epicenter of climate change denial for a long, long time. And our book is focused a lot on the work of the Marshall Institute. Before he went to the Marshall Institute, he was a lobbyist for ExxonMobil and also worked for the American Petroleum Institute. So this is a man with very deep ties to the oil and gas industry, and he played a major role in the campaign to claim that we didn't really know if climate change was real. So I'm going to show you a little clip from the film that in a nutshell sums up really what we're talking about here.
The American Petroleum Institute. He's also a board member of the Global Climate Coalition, made up of oil and electric companies, automakers, and others.
We believed it was a war on oil. They had an off-oil agenda. Climate change was part of that.
I think that it's unfortunate that the science is so distorted and misstated. Without
the science is complicated. There are lots of different factors, so you really have to understand the whole picture.
There is a natural variability that has nothing to do with man.
Climate is changing naturally.
It has to do with sunspots. It has to do with the wobble of the earth.
And so it's not too difficult to persuade some of the public that we really don't know for sure. And so maybe let's wait a while. We need to have more proof.
We need more data. The science isn't there to make that determination.
There is no need for us to rush to this kind of judgment to respond.
Others put out ads saying more pollution is going to be good for us.
A doubling of the CO2 content of the atmosphere will produce a tremendous greening of planet Earth.
CO2 is a benefit to plant life. It's increasing the bounty and the productivity of the planet, our ability to feed populations in this world.
What you're seeing here from the coal industry is perfectly analogous to what the tobacco industry used to do. They refuse to change, refuse to shift, and they're trying to convince us that it's actually good for us. The way they used to say, luckies make you healthy.
There you go. That's John Pasicatando, and when we started doing this work, I realized that actually, he had done a lot of similar things earlier and hadn't really got that much attention for it, so it was great to get him involved in the film. So there it is in a nutshell. You have the scientific community telling you climate change is real, it's happening, and you have coal industry executives, ExxonMobil executives telling you, oh, we don't really know, there's sunspots, there's the wobble of the earth, it's all really complicated, and we need more data, and don't worry anyway, it will be good for you. So, let me go back, though, just for a minute, because even though I can say, well, the scientists were clear, many people are actually unclear about how it is that scientists came to understand that the climate was changing, it was being driven by greenhouse gases. So I want to do here, and I am a historian of science, is to go back and walk you through some of the key elements in the history of science that led to this point where scientists were able to say, yes, this is something that we know to be true, and then talk about how that led to this counter movement to try to challenge the climate science. So in 1995, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reported that the balance of evidence suggested a discernible human impact on global climate. That is to say, the idea that there was climate change had been around for a while already, but in 1995, the scientific community said, yes, the balance of evidence tells us this is in fact true. Now, in 2004, I had done a historical analysis of the published scientific literature in which I showed, going back to the IPCC and looking at peer-reviewed data, that indeed the IPCC result was consistent with what scientists had published in the peer-reviewed literature. And that consensus, by the way, that literature explicitly ruled out sunspots and the wobble of the earth and all of those things that Lee Raidman shakes his head about in the film. The IPCC also had rejected the idea that climate change would be a net good. So I summarized these results in a rather short paper that got a certain amount of attention. And when this paper came out, many people expressed extreme surprise. Many people were under the impression that there really was a big scientific debate going on. What I like to point out is that we really shouldn't have been surprised. It's as if we've suffered a kind of historical amnesia and we've forgotten the history of this story. The fact is that in 1992, President George H.W. Bush signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That convention called upon the world to act to control greenhouse gas emissions and deforestation in order to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. And when President Bush signed the Framework Convention, he called on world leaders to translate the written document into concrete action to protect the planet. He also said he would bring the power of the White House effect to bear on the greenhouse effect. So we knew this was a problem, and in 1992, our president said he was going to do something about it. How did we know it was a problem, though? The pathway to the UN Framework Convention was a long one. like many things in the history of science, when we go back, we find a long story of how scientists have come to their current understanding. And in this case, we could go, where we start the story is somewhat arbitrary, but I like to start with the work of John Tyndall, who was the first person to establish the idea of a greenhouse gas. In a series of experiments in the 1840s and 50s, he established that carbon dioxide and water have this very distinctive and important property of being virtually transparent to visible light, but being quite opaque to infrared. So light from the sun comes in, warms the earth, but the carbon dioxide and water vapor in our atmosphere traps that heat and keeps the planet warm. And by and large, this is a good thing, because without greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, the earth would be as cold as Mars or the moon, and it would not be a hospitable place for life. Sorry, I have to have a Marco Rubio moment here. Now, right around the turn of the century, Svante Arrhenius realized that when you burn fossil fuels, at that time mostly coal, you produce excess carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere. Arrhenius was the first person to suggest then that burning fossil fuels could lead to a warming of the planet. He also did the first calculations of what the effect of doubling carbon dioxide would be, and concluded that it would warm the Earth overall between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees centigrade. Now, he was Swedish, so he thought that would be a good thing. The first person to say that it might be a bad thing was the British steam engineer Guy Stewart Callendar. In 1938, he published what, as far as I know, is the first peer-reviewed paper in a scientific journal suggesting not only that this could happen, but actually that it was already beginning to happen, that there were some data to suggest that carbon dioxide was already beginning to increase and temperature might be increasing too. Now, like a lot of scientists, he became diverted by World War II. He ended up working on defogging and de-icing of airplanes for the Royal Air Force and a variety of other things. And the question of man-made climate change sort of faded from view for about 20 years. But in the mid to late 1950s, it was picked up again by a group of scientists led here in the United States by Hans Suess and Roger Ravel, both scientists at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla. In 1957, Suess and Ravel published a paper in which they said that mankind was performing a great geophysical experiment, because what we were doing was taking the fossil fuels that had been stored, the carbon that had been stored in fossil fuels over hundreds of millions of years of geological time, and now in a relatively short period of time, less than a century, we were taking tremendous amounts of this carbon and returning it to the atmosphere. And they said, this could have an impact on the atmosphere. It's like a kind of experiment, and we should start measuring carbon dioxide, measuring the temperature to see whether or not the increase in carbon dioxide, whether or not carbon dioxide is increasing, and whether or not that is having an impact. So in a sense, they made a prediction based on the work of Arrhenius and Tyndall and others before them, that since we were burning all this fossil fuel, we ought to see an effect on the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we ought to see that effect affect the climate. And so the question was, so is that happening? And this was in the 1950s, so more than 50 years ago. And that became part of the life's work of this man, Charles David Keeling, who in 1958 began the systematic measurement of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that today bears his name, the Keeling curve. And as most of you know, we now know it's measured, it's not just a theory or model. Scientists have measured the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we know that it's 40% higher, so almost half again as high now as it was before the Industrial Revolution. Now, the interesting thing about this from my perspective, though, is that it didn't take until the 1990s or the year 2000 for scientists to say, oh yes, CO2 is increasing. Dave Keeling himself, by 1964, was persuaded that he already had enough data. So if you just look at this little early part of the curve right here, just the first few years, so there's a lot of annual variation. This is essentially winter and summer variation. But just in a few years, he could already see that the amount of CO2 was creeping up by a measurable amount. And so by 1964, he was talking to colleagues, including Ravel and others, about his findings. And as a result of this, Keeling, Ravel, and a number of other scientists actually wrote a report as part of the President's Science Advisory Committee in which they warned that climate change would be likely to occur by the end of the century. And they wrote, by the year 2000, there will be about 25% more CO2 in our atmosphere than at present, and this will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that marked changes in climate could occur. So we knew about this problem in 1965. And not just we scientists, but we, the nation. This report made it to the desk of Lyndon Johnson and became part of a special message to Congress that he delivered in 1965, a special message that was written about in newspapers and magazines. I even found just recently a weekly reader in a school that had a discussion of this speech. And in this speech, Lyndon Johnson said, sorry, I shouldn't call it a speech. It wasn't actually a speech. It was a written message that was transmitted to Congress in written form. But he said, this generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. 1965. But admittedly, in 1965, President Johnson had a war and some, murders in Mississippi and a few other things were going on. So it is the case that even though scientists were trying to talk about the issue, it didn't really generate a lot of concern in policy circles. But that began to change in the 1970s with the rise of digital computation. And scientists began to develop the first general circulation models to study the Earth's climate as a system and to revisit what they now called the calendar question. By the 1970s, there was serious discussion of the issue in policy circles. There were a number of reports written. I just have 3 examples here. A report on energy and climate by Robert White, the director of NOAA. A report by the Jason Group for the Department of Energy on the long-term impact of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And a report that has come to be known as the Charney Report, named after the chair of the committee, Jewel Charney, a very famous meteorologist at MIT, a report written for the National Academy of Sciences. Enough work had been done that by 1979, the National Academy of Sciences issued a press release in which they said, a plethora of studies from diverse sources indicates a consensus that climate changes will result from man's combustion of fossil fuels and changes in land use. That's 1979. We have climate change, we have deforestation, we have greenhouse gases, and we have scientists using the word consensus and saying that they have a consensus that this is going to happen. In other words, we can say there was a scientific consensus in 1979 that climate change from man's activities would happen, and moreover, that when it did happen, it would matter. And the National Research Council wrote, the close linkage between man's welfare and the climatic regime within which his society has evolved suggests that such climatic changes would have profound impacts on human society. What scientists did not yet have a consensus on, though, was when. Most scientists who were writing about this in the 1970s did not think that changes would become detectable until either the end of the 20th century or the beginning of the 21st. So most scientists were surprised when only 6 years later, NASA climate modeler Jim Hansen, who we saw just now in the film, and his team at NASA concluded that man-made climate change was already underway. Hansen testified to this in Congress in 1988, and it was reported on the front page of the New York Times. And one thing I like to point out about this article from the New York Times, if you notice, we've lived for the last 20 years being told we don't really know, so the science is uncertain, maybe there's climate change, we don't know what's really causing it, blah, blah, blah. But look at this, global warming has begun, experts tell Senate, 1988, and notice the headline, global warming, not global warming discovered, but global warming has begun. In other words, this is a prediction that has come true. This testimony and these discussions also led to the introduction into Congress of a bill called the National Energy Policy Act to establish a national energy policy to reduce the generation of carbon dioxide and trace gases as quickly as is feasible in order to slow the pace and degree of global warming. So we actually have Congress, or at least some congressmen, proposing to act on this issue. So what happened? We have science, we have political attention, we have political activity, we have a bill introduced into Congress. But as the scientific consensus emerged and gained media and political attention, so too did a politically motivated challenge to cast doubt on that consensus and to block that action. The campaign, as you saw in that film clip, focused on the claim that the science was uncertain, unsettled, there wasn't a consensus, we didn't really know, science is complicated, and therefore it would be premature to act. And what Eric Conway and I were able to show in our research is that that claim can be traced back to a remarkably small handful of people. In fact, can be traced back to 3 men. And the really interesting thing that we discovered, and what I think makes this a more interesting story than it would be if it were just a story of greed and corruption, is that these 3 men were not executives of fossil fuel companies. They were scientists. They were physicists. They were famous physicists, prominent, brilliant, successful physicists. So these 3 men who founded the George C. Marshall Institute that Bill O'Keefe later ran, Robert Jastrow, shown here on the left, a famous astrophysicist, the head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, did extensive work on rocketry for the United States and played a major role in the Apollo program, and ironically is the man who hired Jim Hansen at NASA. On the right, this man who I knew personally, actually I knew Bob Jastrow personally as well, Bill Nierenberg, the longtime director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, a nuclear physicist who had worked on isotope separation in the Manhattan Project, had worked on numerous projects for the US Navy and anti-submarine warfare, and as I said, the longtime director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California in San Diego. And in the center, the most distinguished of all, Fred Seitz, one of the leading solid-state physicists of the mid-20th century, worked on the hydrogen bomb with Eugene Wigner, was the president of the Rockefeller University, and became president of the US National Academy of Sciences. So all 3 scientists, all 3 famous, all 3 brilliant, all 3 extremely successful. So how do they end up becoming involved in climate change denial? Well, in the early 1980s, these men were all famous and successful because of work they had done in the Cold War on Cold War weapons and rocketry programs, the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, the submarine-launched ballistic missile systems, the atmospheric ballistic missiles, the space program. In the early 1980s, they found themselves working together on an advisory committee to the Reagan administration on the question of the Strategic Defense Initiative, or what was popularly known as Star Wars. Some of you may remember that there was tremendous opposition to missile defense from the scientific community, who thought that it would be expensive, ineffective, and politically destabilizing. But these men supported SDI. And in 1984, they created the Marshall Institute to defend SDI against their own colleagues' opposition, and to promote the continued importance of science and technology in a strong national defense, in part by insisting on the reality of Soviet strength and alleged US weakness. So the argument was that we were at risk at falling behind, and unless we continued to build the next generation of rocketry, of anti-ballistic missile technology, we would fall behind the Soviet Union and we would lose the Cold War. So here's just one example of the sort of thing they wrote. So they wrote many popular articles, they began to write opinion pieces, they wrote pieces for the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, and other conservative media outlets. So here's just one example, this is my favorite one. In 1987, Jastrow published an article in the National Review insisting that if we didn't act quickly to improve our nuclear capability, the Soviets would overtake us and dictate terms. And he says, the headline here, America has 5 years left. So notice the date, 1987, right? 2 years later, the Berlin Wall comes down. So the climate scientists in the story have made much better predictions than the anti-climate scientists. It's also really fun to read the details of these things. If you look closely, he actually invokes Robert Gates. Time is running out for the United States, you know, so in any event. Okay, so now here's where the plot thickens in yet an even more interesting way. So I mentioned that Fred Seitz was a physicist, a very prominent physicist, president of the Rockefeller University. But in the late 1970s, he retired from the Rockefeller University. And he took on another job, a consulting job in his retirement, and that consulting job was working for the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Corporation. Now, as many of you know, as we know from extensive litigation, from media coverage, and from wonderful historical work by colleagues like Robert Proctor at Stanford and Alan Brandt at Harvard, we know a lot about how the tobacco industry tried to prevent tobacco control, tried to prevent the US government, state governments, communities from controlling tobacco use and protecting public health. And the principal strategy that the tobacco industry used to defend its product against the scientific evidence of its harms was what we've come to call doubt-mongering, to try to create doubt in the minds of the American people about whether or not their product was really harmful, even while scientists were telling us that it was. And they did this by insisting the science was unsettled, that there was no consensus, that there are many causes of cancer, that we don't really know what causes any particular cancer. It could be caused by radon, it could be caused by asbestos, and therefore it would be premature for the government to act to control tobacco. In 1989, these two stories came together. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union began to break apart, the Cold War ended, the Iron Curtain was lifted. So you might have thought that these men would be happy. You might have thought that they would have felt that their life's work had come to the fruition that they wanted, that the West had won the Cold War. You might have thought that they would pop champagne corks even, but that's not what they did. Instead, they found a new enemy, and that new enemy was what they called environmental extremism. What they now argued was an exaggeration of environmental threats by people with a left-wing political agenda. And drawing on the experience that Fred Seitz had working for R.J. Reynolds, they applied the tobacco strategy to climate change, to insist that the science was unsettled. So just to give you one example of how the tobacco industry worked, this is a very famous memo that played a very major role in the RICO prosecution of the tobacco industry for conspiracy to commit fraud against the American people. "Doubt is our product," ran the infamous memo written by one tobacco industry executive in 1969, "since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public." But the tobacco industry understood that for doubt-mongering to be persuasive, for journalists and the public to believe it, it wasn't really credible if tobacco industry executives stood up in public and said, "Oh, we think tobacco is safe." Most of us would get it that that was not credible. But if scientists said it, that was a whole different matter. And so a crucial part of the tobacco strategy was to recruit scientific experts, like Fred Seitz, to stand up in public and say that the science was unsettled. So what we've discovered in our research, though, was that it wasn't just tobacco. That these people, Fred Seitz, Bob Jastrow, Bill Nierenberg, and some others, supplied doubt not just about the harms of tobacco, but about the threat of nuclear winter, about the reality of acid rain, about the causes and severity of the ozone hole, and the biggest, greatest, the mother lode environmental issue of all, the reality of global warming. The physicists in this story cast doubt on the science of all of these issues, and in every single case, the playbook was the same. Insist that the science was too uncertain to justify action. As I said, the argument's always the same. The science is unsettled. There's no consensus. There are many causes of the alleged phenomenon. We saw Lee Raymond of ExxonMobil saying that fixing the problem would be too expensive, kill jobs, even wreck the economy. This has been something that's been raised a lot in more recent years, but it was in the tobacco story, the same thing. The economy of the South would be wrecked if we ended tobacco. Fixing the problem will undermine your personal freedom, and therefore, the solution is to do nothing. Now, I just want to give one more example of this to show how the argument plays out and how these different strands become interwoven. So to do that, I want to introduce a fourth character in our story, Fred Singer, also a physicist. In fact, he was the proverbial rocket scientist. He was the first director of the US National Weather Satellite Service. And like the others, was involved in campaigns to challenge the evidence of acid rain, global warming, and the ozone hole, worked with the other three in many cases, and like Fred Seitz, had also worked for the tobacco industry. In the early 1990s, Singer worked with the Philip Morris tobacco company to attack the Environmental Protection Agency over the issue of secondhand smoke. In the early 1990s, the Surgeon General issued another report on smoking. Well, there were many, but another important big one, saying that secondhand smoke could also kill people. And the EPA took up the question of secondhand smoke and concluded that indeed it was a Class A or proven carcinogen. When this happened, the tobacco industry launched a counterattack, and they hired Fred Singer, along with a lawyer named Kent Jeffries, to write a report attacking the EPA and trying to challenge the science upon which the EPA conclusion had been based. The report was called EPA and the Science of Environmental Tobacco Smoke. It was published by a think tank called the Alexis de Tocqueville Institute, and note the evocation of the idea of democracy. I'll say more about that in a moment. But the funding came entirely from the Tobacco Institute, which was the so-called research arm of the tobacco industry. So in other words, the tobacco industry creates an institute that they say is a research institute. That institute gives money to a third party, and a think tank that claims to be independent, but actually isn't, and then the think tank writes the report attacking the EPA. And then it's sent to journalists and congressmen and governors, and it's not obvious if you get this report that this is being managed by the tobacco industry. Now, who was Kent Jeffries? Was he a scientist? No, he was a lawyer affiliated with the Cato Institute and the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So what we begin to see now is that there's a network of think tanks, and what these think tanks have in common is that none of them are scientific research organizations or universities or laboratories. All of them are conservative or libertarian leading think tanks that promote free market solutions to social and economic problems. So as I said, the EPA had declared secondhand smoke to be a proven carcinogen. This result was affirmed by the US Surgeon General and by an independent scientific expert panel that had reviewed the scientific literature, had actually reviewed more than 6,000 peer-reviewed papers, and concluded that secondhand smoke was responsible for more than 3,000 additional adult cancer deaths every year, and between 150 and 300,000 cases of bronchitis and pneumonia in infants and young children. It was also shown to be correlated with an increase in sudden infant death syndrome. So this evidence was supported by diverse, independent, peer-reviewed studies from all around the globe. So why would a rocket scientist challenge this work? And how would he challenge this work? A rocket scientist and a lawyer. They're not oncologists, they're not physicians, they're not biologists. But Singer and Jeffries argued the science was unsettled. They claimed that experts disagreed. They suggested that the EPA should have considered an alternative hypothesis, was that there was a threshold effect, in other words, that smoking was safe up to a certain point, even though there was no evidence to support that. And more importantly, though, that controlling cigarette smoking would be a threat to personal freedom and democracy. And they said in their own words, if we do not carefully delineate the government's role in regulating dangers, there's essentially no limit to how much government can control our lives. And that really, in a nutshell, is the ideological thread that runs through this whole story. And it helps to explain why a group of scientists who did not have stock in ExxonMobil and who at least initially had nothing to do with the tobacco industry made common cause, at first with tobacco, later with ExxonMobil and the oil and gas industry, to defend a set of products that the scientists are telling us are highly dangerous, but because they believe that controlling these products represents a threat to personal liberty. And this is the argument then that was taken up by Republicans in America about climate change. So just to give you one example, Frank Luntz, a famous Republican pollster, made a similar point when he challenged climate science in the Wall Street Journal in 2003. And Luntz Luntz rejected climate science, then he accepted it, then he rejected it again. He's gone back and forth several times, but this is when he was in his rejection phase. He wrote, once we concede that greenhouse gases must be controlled, it will only be a matter of time before we end up endorsing more damaging regulation. So what we begin to see is a fear of government intervention in the marketplace, a fear of government intervention in our lives. In other words, these debates were not about science. They were never about science. The science was settled in 1979. They were about governance and the role of government, and the question, the legitimate question, I would argue, about how much government should intervene in the marketplace to protect people from dangers. But for Fred Singer, the answer was not at all. Now, this argument was obviously extremely convenient to the tobacco industry, but it helps to explain something else, the origins of this story in the Cold War and the role of these Cold War physicists. These were men who had dedicated their lives to containing communism, and this was the argument they made, that government regulation of the marketplace is the slippery slope to socialism, a kind of backdoor to communism. So even though we would have won the Cold War, we would lose in the end through excess regulation. And indeed, in their writings, contrarians frequently assert that environmentalists, and sometimes by implication scientists working on environmental problems, are socialists and communists who seek to control our lives. And I always kind of laugh at this because I think, wow, scientists should be so organized. They call environmentalists watermelons, green on the outside but red on the inside. George Will, the conservative columnist who writes for the Washington Post, has said that environmentalism is a green tree with red roots. James Inhofe has accused me and many of my colleagues as being part of the liberal conspiracy to bring down global capitalism. Again, liberals should be so organized. And the Tea Party represents itself as defenders of freedom while attacking Republicans and Democrats who accept the reality of climate change. In the last presidential election cycle, CBS News ran a story about Mitt Romney when he broke with most of his fellow Republicans and said he did believe that humans had contributed to global warming. The very next day, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich attacked him, saying that the push to address climate change is, quote, the newest excuse to take control of our lives. Now, there are many ironies in the story. There are many things about the claims that the right wing has made about climate change that are simply demonstrably false. The one that's most demonstrably false, and the one that gets me the most as a historian who's worked mostly on the history of environmental science, but also to some extent on the history of environmentalism, is that environmentalism in America is not a green tree with red roots. It's a green tree with green roots, that is to say, money. The origin of the US environmental movement is not to be found in the left-wing labor movements of the 1900s or 1910s. It's not the International Workers of the World or the Union movement or any of the left-wing movements of the late 19th or early 20th century. It's in the progressive republicanism of people like Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, and of course that famous communist John D. Rockefeller. As many of you know, when I give this talk in the East, I have to explain to people what the Grand Teton National Park is, but I know probably most of you recognize this as the Grand Teton National Park. There is the Grand Teton in the middle there, and of course many of you know John D. Rockefeller was almost personally responsible for the fact that the Grand Tetons were made into a national park because he wanted to protect it as a place where wealthy men from the East could come and hunt and fish and be men. But there's an important historical story to tell people here to remind us of that, and it's this. For most of the 20th century, from the 1910s until the 1970s, there was a bipartisan consensus in this country on the importance of environmental protection. And I went and made a whole list of bills that had been passed during the course of the 20th century, and all of these bills passed by broad margins in Congress. And you can go all the way back to 1917, FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, but through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Wilderness Act, the Clean Air Act, the National Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act, it goes on and on and on. All of these bills passed by very wide margins. In fact, the Wilderness Act passed that Senate by a vote of 94-1. And I used to talk about this in my talks, that I was trying to figure out who the one was. And President Obama actually stole that line from me, or maybe he came up with it independently in his inaugural speech last time. But go back. But I actually found out who the one was, and it was someone who voted against it because they didn't think the law was strong enough. So not one person voted against the Wilderness Act because it was too strong or too radical or too left-wing. And of course, as many of you know, the Environmental Protection Agency was created by Richard Nixon, and President Nixon signed into law most of the key pieces of legislation that form the framework of environmental protection in America to this day. the Clean Air Act extension, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and of course, famously, Richard Nixon approved the banning of DDT in America. But things began to change in the 1980s when three important things happened. The first was the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who in response to stalled economic growth in the 1970s began to argue for less government and less regulation as a way to jumpstart the economy, based very strongly on the work of the Chicago economist Milton Friedman, a man who has argued that the only appropriate role of government is to raise armies, print postage stamps, and create currency. The second thing that happened in the 1980s is the Cold War ended. And while most of us, of course, would say that that was a good thing, it had a kind of perverse effect, in my opinion, in the United States. Free market capitalism was largely vindicated by the collapse of the Soviet Union, which demonstrated that the Soviet economic system was not just bad for its people, but was also economically incredibly inefficient. And so to many people, when the Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall fell, there really did seem to be a direct relationship between capitalism and freedom, and that as East Germany was opened up and the Czech Republic, these were opened up to market economies. With the opening up to market economics came a political liberalization and opening up as well. And so this slogan, capitalism is freedom, was promoted by many people in the former Eastern Bloc. But at the same time, the scientific evidence of acid rain and the ozone hole and anthropogenic climate change began to coalesce. And these problems seem to demand more governance, more regulation, and to some extent, yes, a little bit less personal freedom. And that put conservative political policies on a collision course with both the scientific evidence and the environmental protection that that evidence seemed to be demanding. And so Eric Conway and I have argued in our book that it put the Reagan administration, and indeed later much of the Republican Party, on a collision course with science. Because admitting the reality of these problems meant admitting the reality of market failure and the need for the government to intervene to remedy that market failure. Because if we ask ourselves the question, what do tobacco, acid rain, ozone depletion, DDT, and climate change have in common? I haven't talked about DDT tonight in the interest of timing, but that gets thrown in this mix as well. The answer is that they're all market failures. They're all problems that arose from economic activity, like selling and smoking tobacco, or using excessive pesticide use, or burning fossil fuels. Economic activities that generated large external costs. And by the phrase external costs, economists mean costs, real costs to people and to the environment and to public health that are not reflected in the prices of those goods and services, and costs that are borne by people who did not reap the benefit of using those goods and services. And this explains why scientists and science became a target for the advocates of less governance and deregulation. Because it wasn't economists doing economics who discovered these market failures. It was scientists doing science. Scientists who didn't know that the work they were doing was going to put them on a collision course with free market economics. But it did. Because it was science that had led more or less inescapably to the conclusion that some form of government intervention was needed to remedy these market failures. And this is the common thread that unites the diverse science that has been challenged by these merchants of doubt. Science that revealed significant external costs which provided justification for government intervention in the marketplace. Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank, has called anthropogenic global warming the greatest and widest-ranging market failure ever seen. And this explains why global warming has become the fight of all fights, where now, more than half a century after Roger Ravel and Dave Keeling first warned us about this, more than 30, 70, 80, 90 years after Callendar, more than 150 years after Tyndall, we are still fighting about this question because energy consumption, energy use, is at the root of all economic activity, and fossil fuels are our dominant form of energy. So we are talking about something that is at the root of our economic system, and a clash now between the facts of science and the laws of nature and the way we run our economies. And how do you remedy a market failure? Well, any economist will tell you, you remedy a market failure with an intervention that originates outside the market. Now, the good news here, I think, in this story, so like I said, at the end I'm going to try to bring it back to something good, I don't want to leave you depressed, is that despite resistance, we actually solved all those other problems with appropriate government intervention. So if you think about acid rain, we solved acid rain in the Midwest with an emissions trading system under the Clean Air Act amendments. It's also how we solved air pollution in Southern California through emissions trading. If we think about the ozone hole, we solved the problem of ozone depletion by banning the chemicals, CFCs, that cause ozone depletion. Tobacco is a more mixed story. We didn't just do one thing. We've used a mix of instruments. These instruments have included civil and state-based litigation against the tobacco industry, government prosecution under the RICO statutes, ban on smoking in public places, and heavy sin taxes to discourage young people from taking up smoking. We solved these various problems and market failures with government interventions of diverse forms, and those interventions worked. Acid rain and the ozone hole are not significant problems in the United States anymore. Tobacco is still a significant problem in the rest of the world, but it's greatly reduced here in the United States. And here's the key thing. We didn't lose our freedoms. We didn't find ourselves living in a Soviet-style dictatorship. But we did find ourselves expanding the role of the government in the marketplace to some extent. So the merchants of doubt denied the reality of this whole set of problems because they disliked the character of the solutions. And this remains true today. Sociologists actually have a term for this. They call it implicatory denial. It's when you deny the reality of a problem because you don't like the implications of it. You don't like the implications of the solution, or you don't like the implications because of what it tells you about your university or your spouse or whatever it might be. So where does this leave us? Well, I have a few suggestions for things that I think are important for us to take on board as we think about moving forward. And for the first one, I want to just show you one more little clip from the film. And the first one is to recognize the problem of what I'm now calling facsimile science. And some of us talked about this earlier today. One of the things that's really challenging as a citizen when you're faced with the specter of dueling experts on television is how to tell, who's a scientist and who isn't, and what does it look like, and who are these people, and why are they saying the things they're saying. So the reality is that there is a huge amount of stuff out there now that I call facsimile science, stuff that is put forward purporting to be science, but it really isn't. And one of the most important things that we can do is simply to be aware of this, to know about it, and to be on the lookout for it. So I want to show you a little clip in the film where we talk about this problem. They present themselves as scientific, and they even use graphics to make them look like the actual scientific reports that they're trying to discredit.
This is a report produced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And here is the mirror of that, produced by the Cato Institute. They've adopted the exact same page layout design. If you were a congressman, how would you tell the difference between this and this one? And that's the point of this deception.
This is kind of an extended summary. It's called a synthesis report. So the actual IPCC report is about so thick.
And how thick is your NIPCC report?
Same.
It's
same.
You're as thick as they are?
We strictly use the same thickness.
Right, so this is a good little clip because it's humorous, but of course the real problem is actually a very terrible one. And you'll remember the Cato Institute that created that mirror report. They're the same people who funded Ken Jeffries, that lawyer who wrote the report back in the 90s attacking the EPA about secondhand smoke. So that's one thing. Now, a second thing I think that's really important is to understand that there's actually an extremely long history in the United States of the private sector making exaggerated claims that government interventions in the marketplace threaten our freedom as a strategy to protect profits, and in some cases actually constrict competition. So I've been doing some work recently on an episode from the past, and I don't know if you, don't look at the bottom line, I need to block this off, I'll stand here. But I did a talk the other day and I showed this slide and I said to the audience, what do you think this is an advertisement for? I mean, look at the picture. It's a picture of people behind barbed wire. And the advertisement is warning us very, very severely that our freedoms are threatened. I don't know if you can see this, but it says here that, you know, barbed wires we have to protect our freedoms as tightly as dangers abroad. They aren't easy to see. There's this threat that's growing. So it's this very ominous advertisement, and the advertisement is an advertisement for electricity. And it's an argument against government-generated electricity, like hydroelectric power, like the Columbia River. And this was a revisiting in the 1960s, an opposition to some federal dam projects, revisiting an older episode from the 1920s when the National Electric Lighting Association launched a massive campaign in the United States to prevent rural electrification, to prevent people in the country from having electricity, claiming that if we allowed the government to electrify the country, we would soon be living under a socialist dictatorship. So this turns out to be an incredibly old story. And we keep falling for it over and over again. So what I like to say is, you know the old slogan, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. This is like fool me 17 times, you know? So we need to wake up and, okay. Third thing, let's shift the attention and focus on the solutions. I think one of the most important things that all of us who have worked on climate change in recent years have realized is we have to actually stop talking about the science. As long as we keep talking about the science, we're actually stuck in exactly the place that the merchants of doubt want us to be. They want us to be arguing about the science because they don't want us to be talking about the solutions, because the solutions mean changing the way we generate energy in this company and not relying on fossil fuels. And that's why you see Bill O'Keefe saying we thought it was a war on oil. Well, this isn't a war on oil. This is science trying to figure out the reality of the world we live in. But if it turns out that it means we have to stop burning oil and using oil, that's a pretty serious consequence if you're an oil company, but it doesn't mean the science isn't true. So we need to shift the attention to the solutions. The whole point of climate change denial, like tobacco denial before it, is to prevent us from implementing solutions. So the most important thing we can do is to focus on solution and not get mired in debates about the reality or even details of the problems. A fourth thing that I have come to feel, having spent tremendous amounts of time reading pro-free market literature, free market laissez-faire economics, trying to understand the arguments that these people have made, I now believe that it's extremely important for all of us to embrace market-based solutions wherever possible. To the extent that market-based solutions can work, we should embrace them. There's no reason not to. And if it makes our colleagues and friends on the conservative side of the political aisle more comfortable, then great. I mean, market solutions can work. And after all, climate science is not an excuse. It's not a liberal conspiracy to expand the government and bring down global capitalism. It's science trying to figure out how we don't wreck this planet that we need to live on. So this is a problem that needs to get solved before many people get hurt and before we all get a lot poorer. And if we can do that with carbon pricing, carbon taxing, emissions trading, I say all the better. So I'm a strong supporter of carbon pricing. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge the limits of market-based mechanism. A price on carbon, whether it's a tax or an emission trading system, will create incentives for efficiency in the adoption of renewables, and this is really crucial. And virtually all economists who have worked on this absolutely agree we need to put a price on carbon, and I agree with those economic experts. But a carbon tax can only work to the extent that there are workable alternatives available to consumers. Otherwise, they just make the price of energy higher. So we also need to act to make sure that those alternatives are available. And that means we need more investment, public investment in research and development, particularly on issues like grid integration and demand management, which studies show are crucial to being able to achieve a high level of renewable use. And if people are interested, we could talk about that in the Q&A. I can get real geeky really quickly talking about grid integration. But we also have to stop the private sector from blocking competition from renewables, because there's a lot of weird things going on in the country right now. And some of this means we do need regulatory reform in order to actually, I mean, there's like just like the Electric Light Association actually tried to stop competition in electricity in the 20s and 60s, a similar thing is going on now where some utilities are actually trying to block demand response pricing, which is a supply and demand form of pricing for electricity, because they've had a lock on these markets for so long, they don't want competition from renewables. And demand response pricing favors renewables. So there's a lot of complicated issues here, but the point is, we can make market-based mechanisms work, but we have to support them by increasing the availability of alternatives. The market isn't magic. Markets are human institutions, and like all institutions, they have their strengths and weaknesses, their successes and failures. So finally, the most important thing, I think, for us, particularly here in the United States, we have to reject the deification of the marketplace and the demonization of governance, and to remember that the whole point of government is to balance competing interests and to protect the citizens of the country that are being governed. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln said, "We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as a destroyer of liberty." I love that quotation because, you know, this is like before there ever even was a well, actually there were coal companies already in the 1860s, but this is before ExxonMobil ever even existed, right? Isaiah Berlin made the same point slightly differently. Both liberty and equality are among the primary goals pursued by human beings throughout many centuries, but total liberty for wolves is death to the lambs. Total liberty for the powerful, the gifted, is not compatible with the rights to a decent existence and the weak of the less gifted. I gave this talk at the Yellowstone National Park Association a few years ago, and I just used the liberty for wolves is death to lambs like by itself, and then I realized, oh, that's this is a bad place to use that metaphor. So we have to reject the canard that capitalism is equivalent to freedom. It's a catchy slogan, but it's also false. It's not true. We have many examples from history that show us that the relationship between economic systems and political systems are complicated. You can't just reduce it to a single slogan. But if anybody here doubts that capitalism is not necessarily equivalent to freedom, just think about Chile under General Pinochet, where they had a capitalist dictatorship. Or think about China today, which is such a confusing place that economists have been struggling to figure out what to call the Chinese economic system, and they've come up with the phrase market authoritarianism. And of course, here in the United States, for a century, we had slavery, even under an ostensibly capitalist system. Our freedom is not protected by our forms of distributing goods and services, but by our forms of governance, by our laws and the norms of our civil society. So I want to just end with the work of the Yale historian Timothy Snyder, who has just written an incredibly interesting book on the Holocaust, Black Earth. And in that book, towards the end of the book, he draws some lessons about what happened in Eastern Europe for our understanding of questions of freedom and liberty today. And one of the things that Professor Snyder says is that a common American error is to believe that freedom is the absence of state authority. But in fact, the opposite is true. State authority, of course, can be abused, but its absence does not lead to liberty. On the contrary, what Snyder shows us is that its absence actually leads to tyranny and tragedy. Because one of the first steps that the Nazis did, long before they ever even thought of the final solution, when they moved into the occupied countries of Eastern Europe, was to dismantle civic authority and to strip the normal civil protections of citizenship. So Snyder concludes then that appropriate forms of authority are actually essential to the guarantee of liberty. And I extend that and argue that as disruptive climate change unfolds, they will be essential to the guarantee of life and the pursuit of happiness as well. Thank you very much.